Okay, I'm proposing to wait a little bit. Okay, I think we're going to start. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to talk about inclusive finance for biodiversity preservation and promotion. And so small summary about the Club Microfinance Paris. It's a club that has been starting to organize events since 2006. We have organized so far more than 60 events, and we do mainly do it to promote the sector to have some exchanges and debates among the various stakeholders. Originally, it was really done in Paris and physically in Paris and in French, but now thanks to the COVID, we do it online. And if you want to have access to our previous events, I mean, you can have it through the website. And we did organize meetings on what was happening with the microfinance sectors in Myanmar. Was the first one we did it when we went online, and then the last one was on Lebanon crisis. But we have been talking a lot about COVID, of course, crisis, and there was one that is a little bit linked to what we're going to talk about it today, which was the one of the ecological transition. So just to let you know that, I mean, please mute your microphone. The length will be around 1 hour and 30 minutes. We hope to end it up around 8 o'clock. If you do have some questions, feel free to write them on the chat box, and we will be able to answer to them. And we are recording the webinar, so you're going to receive all the documentation regarding this webinar. I'm Philippe Guichandu. I'm working for the Foundation Grameen Crédit Agricole in Paris, and I will have the pleasure to be the moderator of this session. And I'm very pleased to have our 4 speakers. I'm very happy to welcome Sarah Wyatt. She's the biodiversity specialist at the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF. And she leads the work with small island developing state countries to develop biodiversity conservation projects, including park management, sustainable agriculture and fisheries, and addressing invasive species. She also managed the GEF's Inclusive Conservation Initiative, which supports indigenous-led conservation. We have also the pleasure to have with us Alexandre Nem, who is in charge of the coverage of BNP Paribas Inclusive Finance and Social Entrepreneurship activities, mainly in Africa and Central Europe. And he also the project lead for Green Inclusive Finance. And Alexander has worked on Green Microfinance Program on climate resilience and biodiversity preservation together with the UN Environment Program. We have the pleasure also to welcome Pedro Marchetti, who is the co-founder and board members of Financial FDL, a Nicaraguan MFIs with a strong focus on rural and agricultural in the agricultural sector. As a Jesuit, he has held academic posts at universities in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, and co-founding research program and research institute. And is currently executive director of a research institute recently founded by Maya Corti Community Authorities. And he's also a member of the EMFP Green Inclusive and Climate Smart Finance Action Group. And last but not least, Davide Forcella, who is the director of the new Just Sustainability Transition Institute, the Just Institute, which is a not-for-profit member-based entity that is working on inclusive finance for biodiversity, climate change, and positive finance. He's also the head of the Green Inclusive Climate and Smart Finance Action Group of the European Microfinance Platform, and an associate research in Green Inclusive Finance at the Center for European Research in Microfinance. So as we can see, we do have lots of people that have lots of experiences, and we're going to share together. Why the Club Microfinance Paris was interesting to work on these issues is mainly with, I will give you a few figures. We know that now, unfortunately, more than 2/3 of wild vertebrates disappeared between 1970 and 2018, according to the WWF Living Planet Index, which covers more than 5,000 species. And of course, the main impact for this decline in biodiversity are deforestation, overexploitation of resources, and climate changes. The main reason, which will be the main cause of global warming, of course, if it exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius. What is important to notice is that there will be in December in Montreal, the COP15 on biodiversity, which is not that well known. I mean, for a large public, it's more, we heard about the COP, of course, but not this one. And what is quite surprising is that we do not expect to have many head of states part of this big conference. So this subject is certainly key for the future of us and the planet. And I hope that with our speakers, we will have better understanding of how inclusive finance can support this biodiversity. And so I'm going to give the floor first to Sarah, that's going to start with the definition of what we mean by the biodiversity. And then we were going to go through three main points. What are the lessons learned of the activities that have been conducted on the subject? What are the challenges that have been faced, and what are the potential solutions for that? And I hope that each speaker has no more than 5 minutes for each topic, that we will keep the timing so that we can have time for Q&A. So I give the floor to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Philippe. It's really a pleasure to join all of you and be in kind of around a different set of people. And I'm looking forward to these conversations. So as the person who actually has biodiversity in my job title, I got tasked with explaining what is biodiversity, first of all, and a few kind of important concepts to remember as we start having these conversations. Simply put, biodiversity is the full variety of life on Earth. I'm going to assume most of you are at least familiar with some of these concepts and ideas. It's important to remember that biodiversity is not just about species or individual species, but it ranges from genes to the population, so different groups within species and the variety and variation that you get there, as well as then ecosystems. So the interactions that you have among species with their and with their sort of abiotic or natural environment, all of that tying together forms biodiversity as well. So all of those really complicated interactions. Now, I tend to think that I've come up with the analogy that our current way of operating as humans on this planet is we are basically playing blind random Jenga. Jenga, if you don't know, that game on the side there. What we are doing is knocking out pieces. We don't know what pieces we're taking out. So you're not testing, to see which ones actually move and don't fall over. But instead, we're just taking them out. We don't know which species or which action may lead to a tipping point. We don't know what that tipping point is going to be. Maybe it's halfway up the scale, maybe it's all the way up the top, or it's way down at the bottom. But that's also a really good analogy, because as you start pulling out pieces, you start making the structure weaker, right? And so that is what we are facing, this kind of these weakened ecosystems that are less resilient, less able to handle a jolt on the table or a major storm or other activity. Another concept that I think is important to share from the biodiversity world is the concept of extinction debt. So this is the idea I'm bringing over using some finance terms for all of you, but this is the idea that we are living on borrowed time, that our actions, even if you stopped doing anything else to hurt nature today, you would actually see ongoing long-term impacts on biodiversity, we would continue to lose species. We continue to lose ecosystem function just by the impacts we've had, by kind of the fragmentation that the natural ecosystems are experiencing. At the bottom, you can see a picture of the Panama Canal. And in the Panama Canal, there's a pretty famous island called Barro Colorado Island. Any tropical biologist will know about this place. This island was created in 1913 when the Panama Canal was created. And it's one of the most heavily studied places on this planet, at least in the tropical world. And we are continuing to see changes over a century later in the ecosystem that are happening as different impacts occur, as you have different chain reactions. And so this is what I'm talking about when we talk about extinction debt, an ongoing loss of function. So next slide.
Sorry.
It's okay. So what I'm going to talk about on this next slide is why, if you care about poverty, honestly, I would argue as a biodiversity specialist that you should be caring about biodiversity as one of your top issues. So if you think about, I just started thinking about how to explain this. I thought about trees. Just take a few trees, right? So look at that little area over there on the right. In the column on the left, those are probably the ecosystem services, the benefits we get from nature that you would think of, right? These are the things that easily come to mind: food, building materials, fuel, medicines. I want you to take a look at that middle column, right? These are the benefits of nature that you might not as readily think about, or these are what a tree, just a tree or a few trees, could provide for you. One of the most important topics that I think is often overlooked is water. You get groundwater recharge, so it's recharging aquifers and benefiting people through that. The slowing of stormwater and other storms. So trees, think about if you walk under a tree, during a rainstorm and that suddenly you're not being hit with as many raindrops, they are slowing the water. That means, reducing the impact of these storms that we get, and are going to get worse with climate change. We've seen some of the impacts of flooding around the world. Also to highlight cooling. Simply in a tropical, in the tropical ecosystems, studies have found that you can have over a 10-degree C cooler environment under a tree in the shade, which is pretty substantial when we start talking about adaptation to climate change and how you survive, even just in the existing world that we have. You have you're providing food and shelter to pollinators, which are key, and I'll get to that, but then to the predators for pests. We have studies that would show that simply the value of bats in a certain over cotton fields is worth more than the profit margin of those farmers when they're farming cotton. So there are numerous ways, and I honestly think sometimes these are almost more important than what you see on the left, or at least equally important. And I also don't want to ignore the sort of spiritual and cultural value of nature. Nature is the place nature is your sense of place. Nature is what makes a place what it is. And you don't want to ignore that when then you start talking about biodiversity. So next slide. If you take nothing else away from what I'm saying, I want you to understand that this what I have at the top. Nature is the GDP of the poor. Nature is what supports the poorest and most marginalized people the most. These are the people who are most dependent on nature. These are people with the least ability to change their activities if climate change, if they're impacted by climate change, they're less resilient. And so I just gave you a few kind of smattering of facts, depending on what might interest you most, whether it's the value of pollinators for crops. You have over 1 billion people on this planet who depend on fish as their primary food source, therefore coral reefs and the health of the oceans. With disaster risk, we can go into all kinds of statistics about how disaster matters. You know, I can cite the fact that 80% of Bogota's water comes from 2 national parks that are collecting the water and getting it into the ground so that there is water for people. You can also, there are also multiple studies that have showed that increased deforestation is linked to increased malaria risk. And lastly, I feel like I can't have this conversation and discuss without talking about the fact that women are even more dependent on nature. So that last little statistic, 80% of food production in sub-Saharan Africa is done by women. And what we know is that biodiversity and the conservation of nature is key to having actual successful agriculture, right? You need the pollinators, you need healthy soils, you need, you know, those trees that are providing fruits and other benefits. So this is my attempt to very, very quickly run through a lot of information. I hope that it kind of covers that. Always happy to answer questions. So I'll just go to the next slide. We'll move on to kind of the next section. I get to introduce my organization and then sit back a little bit and learn from others here. So I work for the Global Environment Facility. Sometimes I call it the best kept secret in the environmental community and probably in the wider development community. We're an international partnership to address the protection of the global environment and promote national sustainable development initiatives. We were founded in 1991. We work in a variety of environmental areas that are connected to these international agreements: climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, toxic chemicals, as well as cooperation around the management of international waters. We've supported projects in 170 countries with over $18 billion in grants and over 4,500 projects. And we also, so in this our current cycle, our current 4-year cycle that just started in July, we have $5.33 billion to give away to support the environment in these different areas. For those of you who really work in the microfinance or smaller sector, I did include in the bottom right, you might not be able to see it very well depending on how your Zoom looks, but the Jeff Small Grants program that many of you may be more familiar with, which is a program that we have that operates at the national level, providing grants of $25,000, $50,000 to CSOs to support all work in all of those different environmental sectors. So with that, I think I ran through a lot of information.
Yeah, and a little bit more than 5 minutes, but that's okay. I hope that your other colleagues will not follow you, except that I really like what you say, that I mean, by the biodiversity, the GDP for the poor, and I think that what you said was very, very interesting at that level. So now let's try to see what are the lessons that we have learned so far working on these issues, and I will give the floor to Davide.
So thanks a lot. First of all, I need to apologize because my camera is not working, so that's bad for you. And I would like to thank, after this huge and amazing presentation, I need to try to keep up the level. I want to stress one thing that has been just said, as biodiversity is GDP of the poor. Moreover, nature is the backbones of our economy. So order of 40, 50 trillions of our economy depend on nature. So it is really a systemic issue, it's focused on poor, but a systemic issue for all our global economy. And so that is really a material problem for, you know, both businesses and people. Now, if I want to step a bit back and we want to understand how marginalized population or poor households, smallholder, small micro enterprise could be supported to conserve biodiversity, and through that generate better revenue for their own families and attach to more strong value chain, we need to see what are the possible solutions that could be promoted there and how to finance them. Here I put some picture coming from the project made by Biodiversity from United Nations for Environment, and some list of pragmatical activities that we could call as conserving agro-biodiversity. Yeah, I want to step back a bit. Biodiversity is a big topic, of course, and then there is a part that is linked to the human production, and one of that is agriculture. So let me just focus into that, is how we can use agricultural practices to preserve or reconstitute partially biodiversity and use that for the production. So you see example here as beekeeping, as bees, as you could imagine, is clearly an example of biodiversity. Seed banks, so local seeds, crop diversification, so diversification of production, that of course is part of the side of biodiversity. Agroforestry, of course, that means mixing forestry with agriculture production, and various other that you see here. But then next slide, please. If we, the topic of green inclusive finance has been increasing recently, is still very far away from where it should be as even of course the conventional finance. But if you will focus into biodiversity, there is still even more to be done. There has been quite some focus on climate recently, still far away from what needed. But biodiversity is sort of a new topic for microfinance in terms of size. Nevertheless, there has been quite some history that I can trace back at least to 2008, so order of 15 years of history, where there have been projects there has been trying to support biodiversity conservation at local level by working with micro, small, and medium enterprises. That is just a sample. Of course, there are many more than this and many more experience. I just try to take a lenses. And I'm proud that the first project that I can recollect the size was sponsored by the Jeff. So that was called the Proyecto Cambio. We will learn a bit more probably from Pedro, where Nitlapan and FDL has been implementing it with great success. That project was already quite massive in style because it was focusing on 5 countries, working with the 26 financial institutions, so both microfinance and local banks, reaching around 25,000 micro, small, and medium enterprises with an amount of loan for what was defined by diversity-friendly practices. Remember the one before, like agroforestry, soil diversification, rotation, living fencing, etc., with around 2.3 million of grants. There has been then another project that I would like to highlight, that has been the project MEBA. So MEBA is about microfinance for ecosystem-based adaptation that has been promoted and implemented by United Nations for Environment. There as well, expansion in number of countries. That was also expanding in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, reaching 30 microfinance institutions. There the focus was on smallholders only, with around 5 million of grants. And what was interesting, was able to collect in stage 2 private money co-finance. That of course is key to support this transition. An evolution of that was a focus on biodiversity, supported by the United Nations for Environment, the BNP Paribas, and other actors, where we've been focusing more on training institutions on how to include the assessment of biodiversity risk into their client assessment and portfolio management, and the focus into technology. This step has been allowed to have, of course, a less in-depth impact, nevertheless, a much bigger outreach. So 35 institutions in 11 countries, and is a way in which we generate capacity. I want just to step, next step that we've been following this path, not just a second, and I'm almost done, is an interesting follow-up that has been done by some of the present organizations, so Fondation Grameen Crédit Agricole, the BNP Paribas, and also other that are not present here. So the YAPU, the CD, Oiko Credit, and the Foundation BBVA, where we try to generate some lesson learned from these projects and try to develop a sort of list of indicators that investors could be interested to support refinancing biodiversity conservation for microfinance institutions. Next slide. And I try to speed up.
Yes, please.
I zoom out, as said by my colleague Sarah, to say what the Just Institute is. The Just Institute is a newly founded institute that's clearly try and this is a focus and objective to make this happening. So our key focus is to support the market development so that there will be opportunity to be financed and channel to finance this opportunity, enable various stakeholders with capacity and dedicated finance to preserve biodiversity and climate change adaptation. Is a non-for-profit, is a social business, is member-based, has been launched and will be launched more prominently during the COP together with the BNP Paribas Group and the Global Environmental Facility here present. It is independent, and the most important thing I want to stress is to try that we are working on the interlinkages between biodiversity, climate, and inclusive, and trying to build bridges that we will see in the challenge part that I think are among the most important ones, still between the private and public sector, as well as between what is still called conventional finance, so the big finance, let's say, and the inclusive finance. Voila, please.
Thank you. Thank you to share with us the previous experiences that has been going on in the sectors, and I think we are also very pleased to see that this new JUST Institute is coming up, and I'm sure that it will be very useful for the whole sectors to move on the issue. But let's go now back more to also a concrete example of what has been done with you, Pedro, and your institutions. What have you learned? Please put your microphone, Pedro. Just need to click on.
Very important. Okay. Yeah. Good morning, all of you.
Good evening in Paris.
Oh, good evening. Yes, it's morning here, right? Good evening.
Thanks.
Anyway, I've had 36 years of experience in microfinance. That was when I was about 37 years old, so I'm a lot older than that. We have given loans, 140 million green portfolio loans, right? And our institutions, NIT LAPAN and FDL, we have 10 years of experimentation with funds from the World Bank, from the GEF, IDB, and Regional Central American Bank. And Sarah, yes, you were there. You were a great help to us. The project you supported for us helped us contribute and change a bit the Cambio project that Pierre just talked about. Now, that's all pretty qualitative, you know, when we had the World Bank come through and do a measurement of all those millions of dollars of loans, and they found that only 25% of our loans were really climatically intelligent, right? That doesn't mean we wasted $105 million, no. But it doesn't even mean that those $63 million did anything to mitigate biodiversity loss, right? The FDL and NIT LAPAN have been highly successful in facilitating micro-enterprise resilience to climate change. We had a great success with the coffee crisis, with the Roya disease, in which we were able to get through that very easily with green finance, right? But getting awards from the IDB in Latin America or getting an award in Europe isn't the same thing as doing anything about biodiversity loss, right? And I'm going to make a point too that today, probably most importantly, we have a problem of diversity loss in the microfinance industry, and that facing that diversity loss in the industry is going to be a way to deal with biodiversity. Okay, here are the lessons we learned. Number one is combine financial, non-financial, and territorial services. And what does that mean? That means putting together green technical assistance with bio awards for ecological service. Those are different in paying for ecological services. Financial products which award green transformations promised by the clients. The reward here is reduced interest rates. For the microfinance people here, reducing interest rates is what BRI has done in Indonesia. I consider it the best microfinance institution in the world, even though it's public. reducing interest rates is a great game, and it doesn't make you a lot of money, but it's what really works to keep your quality up. And finally, territorial services. The Cambio project that David talked about didn't have territorial services connected to it, and we discovered that that's very important. Now, the second thing, you can combine these different services, but if you don't have the people to do it, it doesn't work, right? So that means fine-tuning coordination between multiple actors, which is a harder task. Your credit officials, your green technical assistance officials, your board members and the committees, and with territorial development initiatives. And that means also having to deal with governments, right? And that's where the rub comes. It's probably the hardest coordination is with the government. Now, the third lesson we've learned is match intelligent subsidies, right? You have to do that. And that means finance your own subsidies, right? From your own profits, and look for matches with international cooperation. Over the years, we actually put in $5 million in green technical assistance, and we were able to move another $1 million from international cooperation. So we put 5 in and we got 1 back. And all of this, we have to say that David's research has shown over the last 7 years that it's mature, profitable institutions that engage in green finance, right? And the question is, where then? Do we have profitable institutions where biodiversity still exists? Or do we just have profitable institutions in the cities, right? From Latin America, our mega banks in Latin America who concentrate all the subsidized ecological loans are in the cities, right? It's hard to get to the countryside. So, but we have been able to do this because we've been profitable, but when we're not profitable, for instance, with the political crisis and the economic depression of the last 4 years, we've had to cut back our subsidies drastically. Green finance is profitable, but it demands cross-subsidization. And that means if you're not doing well in the whole organization, it's hard to cross-subsidize quality green financing. Okay, I think one more. How much time do I have, Philippe? Do I have a little time or not?
It's okay, two more minutes.
Okay, fine, we're doing okay. What we've learned about the context that we operate in is that policy architectures for global warming are failing. The Paris Accords, of course, are a complete disaster in terms of what's happening. We all know that. And not only are we failing with global warming, but all the recent research by Simmons and that whole group is that the current policies we have about biodiversity don't meet the basic conditions for responding to the UN's Convention on Global Biodiversity Framework Goals. So our policies, our policy architectures are not helping us. That's the first lesson we've learned. The other lesson that we've learned, this really hard lesson, macroeconomic stability on a worldwide level, it requires cheap money, cheap energy, cheap labor. It requires the 7 cheaps. As David said, over 50% of our GDP is based on nature, right? But we have, at this point, we have 16% of all our money at about 0%, very cheap. That's $13 trillion at around 0%, right? And what the argument here is that our current form of business, our current form of capitalism depends on cheap money. It depends on a lot of cheaps, and including nature. And half of our GDP depends on nature, and we depend on putting a very low price on biodiversity, on ecosystems, right? And the next lesson we have is our success in inclusive and resilient microfinance practice does not translate into ecosystem resilience. It does not translate into dealing with biodiversity loss because the penetration of our financial products never goes over 20%, even in Nicaragua, which is the poster child of agricultural finance. So that means, for every producer we make resilient, we have 4 make resilient producers who are helping the ecosystem. We have 4 who are destroying it. So it's not enough to be resilient and it's not enough to be inclusive. We need something else. I believe microfinance can make a huge difference, but it has too little diversity to deal with the challenge of biodiversity and ecosystem regeneration. We know how to do it, but we need really, and I'm going to make this argument a little bit later, we need a second microfinance revolution. The first revolution was in the cost of transaction. We need a second microfinance revolution. We need great diversity among microfinance institutions who begin to carry out this second revolution that I believe is needed if we want to deal with the crisis of biodiversity. We have the extinction debt, but just to go along with what Sarah said, if we stopped all emissions today, we would still be at 1.2, where we are now, temperature rise. It won't go away for 100 years. There's 100 years for this planet to cool off. So this is very, very something. And just we'll see later what the dependence of poor on nature is and what they can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. I think that we will all remember this second revolution that we have to work on. So I don't know how Alexander from BNP Paribas can react on this and share their own experience at that level. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Philippe. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I'm not going to rephrase Pedro or Sarah or Davide. And then I'll talk later about this need for this new revolution as well. I wanted to start with the lesson learned. So what the bank like BNP Paribas can say about the way it's trying to tackle this huge biodiversity challenge, trying to illustrate all the different steps that have been followed in order to give some ideas to other financial institutions or other stakeholders working on similar topics. So the first step would be to identify the most sensitive sector and industry. So if it's sensitive for you, it might not be sensitive for another actor. And on BNP Paribas side, we have identified deforestation, forestry, of course, and the protection of natural areas as well as agriculture as a whole, as very sensitive topics, because we had geographical exposure with regard to those activities, and also an important client base. So you need to align those materiality, the materiality of those topics with your actual exposure. So once you've done that, you can set up sectoral policies, which are a way to engage with corporates that are actually willing to adopt more sustainable practices. So it's more a way to accompany rather than exclude. And I think it's a very important point. Of course, limiting your negative impact on biodiversity is far from being enough, but you can always start by doing that. Then you can define or create or design financial instruments that are innovative, that are able to accompany your client in their sustainable agenda. So I think we'll be talking about those type of instruments, and we are talking about green bonds, about impact bonds, about sustainability linked loans, about sustainability linked bonds, about blended finance mechanism, and about thematic fund if you are more on the asset management side. You can advance the agenda by making concrete commitments, and they are even more powerful if they are done publicly. to set internal or external measured objectives. And that's what BNP has done with the signing and the commitment with the E4E, so Enterprise for Environment, and the WBCSD, so the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, to actually commit on reaching certain amount of financing directly linked to biodiversity conservation. So it actually gives you a great internal impetus to reach those goals. You need to train your staff. It's very important. Biodiversity is unfortunately a pretty new topic in the finance world. That's why we are actually rolling out a group-wide sustainability academy where biodiversity is going to play a very important role. And it has been designed together with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, in case you know it. The other lesson that we learned is that the fact that you need to work with other people to join coalitions. The very famous one in the financial sector is of course the TNFD, so the Task Force for Natural Financial Disclosure. We joined, for instance, at BNP Paribas, also the Act for Nature and the Cerrado Manifesto, that is very much focusing on deforestation in the Latin American continent. As Davide said, biodiversity has become the new frontier. But all the work that has been done on the greenhouse gas emissions is actually helping the purpose, as the pedagogical, the educational work has been already done. So let's say that the first dam has been crushed already, and it's easier now to incorporate additional green indicators, although they are much more complex. They are hard to measure, and we'll discuss those in details when it comes to the challenges in the next slides. So that's it for me. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Alexander, to share with a different point of view. I mean, the one from a bank, a very, very large bank, and I think it's very, very good to see how committed you are to try to find a solution and to do things. So I don't know if Sarah, you want to comment, if you have a few comments, or we move on. I mean, we move on. Okay, perfect. Okay, so we thought it was very important to see. Okay, we have learned some lessons, and I think that we all hear what have been said by the different speakers. But now I think there is, of course, in front of us challenges, and I would say somehow lots of challenges. And so I wanted to see with you, I mean, what are your main challenges? What do you think will be the main challenges to work on this issue of biodiversity? I mean, we know that time is not in our favor. I mean, it was very, very fast. And so I will ask Davide to share what is their view, I mean, on the Just Institute side. I mean, what is the view of the challenge, and especially the challenge for the inclusive financial sectors, as we are here, I mean, to talk about what microfinance actors can do. And Pedro said that we can do a lot, but for that we need first to face quite a few challenges. Davide?
Thanks a lot for the word. So in terms of challenge, as said, but the main challenge ahead we have, or let's say the main problem before the challenge, is that we are not achieving what we need to achieve. So we have objectives in terms of financing green transition and just transition that are still far away to be achieved or be on the right direction to be achieved. Within that, the topic of climate change adaptation is still even less addressed. And if you speak about biodiversity conservation a bit, with all the, I would not like to call it excuse, but the fact that we used to say it's more complicated is still even lacking behind. And if we speak about that this should be trickled down to poor house or smallholder, small medium enterprises, even more far away. No, there are studies that show that less than 10% of the climate finance really reach a smallholder at the end of the day. So there are challenges that are basically everywhere and similar in the green finance world. If you think about the inclusive side, typically they are more exacerbated because the availability of information is even less. And if you speak about biodiversity, they become even more complicated because the topic is supposed to be more complex. Now, I would like to don't making pass the message that the challenge or the barrier are so big that we cannot act. That would be the wrong side to see the problem, because we have to act, as Sarah was saying, is part of our life, biodiversity. So is our life, by the way. And so we need to not saying the challenge are complicated so we can avoid to act, but instead that is our objective and we need to find a good way and we will see the solution how to do it. So there is no way to do not act. Now, if you want to summarize the challenge in terms of key barriers, we have been observing 3, discussing both with private actors and public actors, as well as, of course, through our own experience. First of all, it's what we call lack of transparency. Lack of transparency means we don't really know who is doing what. So if you look, for example, to a microfinance institution, it's not very clear what is inside the portfolio and which kind of activities and technologies, financed or practices can contribute to biodiversity conservation. So this transparency need to be improved, because if you don't know, I will not say the detail, but even far away, what is inside the portfolio that correspond to biodiversity risk or solution, it's difficult to make any step to try to support the improvement of biodiversity conservation. Then the second barrier is about the lack of capacity. You need your field forces in terms of field officer, but there's also in terms of management that are able to incorporate what biodiversity is in terms of client risk and portfolio risk, as well as in terms of strategies and processes in portfolio management, as well as being able then to identify practices and technology that could compensate for this risk and generate better revenue for the client to support them to restore the local biodiversity. And last but not least, of course, even if you will be able to solve this transparency and capacity, then you need to have the right instruments to finance the transition. As Peter clearly stated, is not just to have to adapt our loans, but really to have the good instrument that are focused on to biodiversity, if not that can generate perversion. So that's, there are, as of today, there are really not fitted products that can finance a just transition. That is the focus of our action of the Just Institute, to see how can we adapt existing product and financial and non-financial to support this transition. I want to close with one thing. I think, as we heard many times, both from Sarah and Peter, that's no matter what we do, it will last for us for long. We need to stop thinking the solution for the next year. So we have a trajectory for at least the next 100 years, probably much longer. So we cannot allow ourselves to go on project by project. That is still the approach we have, and innovation by innovation. That typically imply a lack of capitalization, to try to build on what has been learned and to expand. I want to close with one reflection. It's about working in silos. As we've seen, biodiversity, we've been hearing, is the GDP of the poor, is affecting half of our economy, probably the full our economy, and still we are working in silos. So what is micro-enterprise is micro-enterprise, what is SME, what is corporate, et cetera. And Alex was mentioning clearly, for example, the task force for nature-related financial disclosure that is key for the private sector and as well as for the public sector and for the conventional finance. The question is how that is related, for example, to the project that has been discussed that instead of focusing on microfinance. If you are not able to build this linkage between what are the solutions locally for microenterprise, smallholder, etc., and what are the solutions globally for what is nowadays called conventional finance, that's clearly we will not going to solve the problem. Over.
Thank you. I think that the analysis is very, very relevant, and I think we can make links with what was said before with lack of capacity, training staff, and all this issue. Excuse me. Okay, so Pedro, what have been your main challenges?
Okay, I mean, I think our main challenge, even though we've got 100 years, as David says, we really have to start working right now. Our challenge is the next 5 or 10 years, because if we don't do that, you know, we're going to have climate change, and really we're going to have the extinction debt off the chart. People talk about the 6th massive extinction. I think they're right. But now the key challenge for me for microfinance is this. We have to move from individual entrepreneurship, which we've done in Cambio. This is Economico picture is from the IADB, Inter-American Development Bank in our hemisphere. We have to move from financing entrepreneurs to financing ecosystems, to financing biodiversity. You want to, pretty simply, we want to change from financing human beings to financing nature. And from where we sit, we know that nature has its own agency. Now, to do this, we have to overcome what we call microfinance narcissism. And that is that we think that what we do is the center of everything, that entrepreneurial resilience is the core of our life, right? And so we don't want to just adapt micro enterprises. We actually have to go from that to mitigation, rollback, and regeneration of biodiversity. And that means taking our focus off the micro enterprise, taking our focus off the enterprise and putting it on nature. Next slide. And that's the second revolution we're talking about. How to make the move to nature instead of enterprise, right? Okay, we'll go at this slowly now. 1 second here. I just lost my okay, here you have a picture. That is a project that everyone has always loved, right? Because it met the challenges. The project began in the year about 92, 93. It was called Trees Are Worth It, right? And what happened with this project, we started with letting people design agroforestry systems in about 90 hectares. And what happened was that project took off and was like wildfire across the whole Pacific coast of Nicaragua, moving along the center to northern Pacific coast. And that was all done without a single cent of financing. It was all compassing peasant to peasant. It just went because it was the right answer. Now, what we want to say about that is that it was a move from an enterprise, because we didn't really give them any credit, right, to financing the diverse ecosystem they wanted, right? And here is one of the things I want as a take-home point. We're talking about locally led regeneration of ecosystems. That's what David means when we don't have adaptation. The only way to adapt really to what's going on is to let local agencies lead the regeneration and not have them just carrying out projects that we worked out on our desk in Europe or in Washington. The thing is there's 80 countries who've signed on to the locally led development adaptation system, right? And it's one thing to sign on to the principles of locally led. It's another thing to actually do it. And to do that, you really have to listen to indigenous peasants. And listening to people, those people who are the poorest, who, as Sarah has said so clearly, the ones who depend most on the environment, depend most on nature, you have to listen to them, because they're not only that, they're the ones who actually can respond best. Not in all circumstances, but when the economy is stable, the poorest can actually respond best to what we want to do. Now, the next thing, I mean, we have this local ed. If we do this, we have to align the second and tier microfinance institutions with financing ecosystems and meeting biodiversity convention goals. And that's why I like so much what Alexander was saying. This is his bank is a very, very important third tier microfinance institution because it's supporting microfinance. And it's this type of move. And, you know, I would say that Paribank has to move even more radically along the path it is taken. So that alignment is crucial. And then, you know, this is like a cyclical thing. If we're not developing financing of ecosystem on the ground, then, you know, Paribank has nothing to finance. We have to do that on the ground, right? But once we begin doing that, and there are examples around the world of it can be done, it gets financed, but then we have to measure, and this is crucial, we have to connect climatically intelligent practices, biodiversity intelligent practices to a range of specific biometrics and practices that improve and regenerate our ecosystems. So that's very, very, very important. But I want to just go back and say one thing now about this. I think I still have just a little bit of time. Why did the trees are worth it take off? Why was it so effective? Why is it the poster child of agrosystems? It happened because at the same time, the entire cotton industry on the Pacific coast crashed and burned due to competition, basically from India. So the system that was there controlling the poor disappeared, and that opened a space for the poor. I don't know how to put this more clearly, but we're going to have to stop British Petroleum. We're going to have to stop Shell. They're going to have to crash and burn. I don't see that coming around the corner, but they're going to either have to slow down what they're doing to open up space for people who can actually deal with the biodiversity loss crisis. So it's not just having the right project, it needs a context. It needs a context, and the major context, what we really need in the world today is to make nature much more expensive. Okay, I think I'm probably close to 5 minutes, so you can.
Yeah. And we have to move on, so I will not make any comments, but give the floor to Alexander on how they see the challenge, and especially to respond to what has been shared by Pedro and Davide.
Yes, thanks, Philippe. So yeah, I mean, we already stressed, you know, how hard those challenges, you know, how to overcome. You know, the topic of biodiversity has been under the radar for only a few years again in the finance sector. So we have, you know, a lot of. We don't have so much time to catch up, and the urgency, of course, is there. The materiality of biodiversity erosion is, especially in the rural communities, is not easy to evidence technically. So that's why, you know, the topic has you know, taken so long to develop, and those, you know, indirect causal relationships between biodiversity erosions and the actual well-being of rural communities as you know, came a little bit late, and it is quite complex. It's easier to understand the concept of resilience, so that's why, you know, many of the projects are seeing, you know, those positive externalities as resilience rather than you know, biodiversity conservation. This complex dimension is of course intertwined, you know, with the, you know, many other ones, especially around climate adaptation. And they are, of course, you know, very difficult to measure. So we are not going to enter into the, you know, into the debate as to what is the best way to measure biodiversity today. But what is for sure is that there's not yet one single approach which has been defined as consensual. Of course, there is, you know, your mean average species, which is now more, you know, more popular. But it's not enough to align all the let's say all the methodologies in order to assess at what level the biodiversity and the ecosystems are being damaged. As Pedro said, there is a very explosive cocktail at the moment with the fact that people that are very vulnerable to climate change and to biodiversity loss are also people that are socially very much excluded. The fact that Sarah called it the GDP of the poor, I think is very relevant. So the challenge for us is to be wary of not putting too many additional constraints on a population which is of course already suffering and bearing the brunt for climate change, which is why I think the key would be to fine-tune the right mechanisms, embedding capacity building, as we said, so with technical assistance, but also to have short-term incentives, because there is of course an issue around aligning the time horizons, which are not the same for investors, which are not the same for microfinance institutions, who are not the same for rural communities themselves. And to also embed data collection mechanism within this package. So inclusive finance has been successful, as Pedro said again, in lowering the cost of transaction by industrializing, by streamlining all of its processes. It is now facing a much more complex environment and dimension, which is around the incorporation of the let's say the environmental parameter around the activity that it finances. So the challenges is how the sector is really will really be able to integrate those aspects while adopting a real pragmatic approach, because that's again why microfinance has been succeeding in the past, and that's the only way this new revolution that Pedro is calling for will be able to take off. Thank you.
Thank you. We heard revolution, explosive cocktail. So I think it's a very challenging, of course, dilemma that we have in front of us. And I will let Sarah, from on your side, what you see as the main challenges.
So those were some really interesting thoughts. I'm going to try to just add what I have here. It's kind of slightly random assortment of thoughts coming from I get to sit at the 30,000 foot level, dealing with a lot of different projects in a lot of different places. When it comes to lending institutions, what we see is that there's often a lack of knowledge of biodiversity and more innovative systems. I'm particularly thinking of agriculture as being a really good example of this. You could carry it out to fisheries, to forestry, to tourism management even, but I think agriculture is easy to get your brain around. So there's often a lack of knowledge of these innovative systems. A loan officer may have a checklist that they're using. And so how do you score something that doesn't fit into boxes? And the added complication, right, that biodiversity is place-based. So unlike carbon, CO2, where you work and what you're doing matters. So in some places, putting up fences is a negative. In some places, like where Pedro is, putting up fences is probably a positive because it reduces conflict with jaguars and cows going into the forest. And so, this is not easy. And then you're putting a lot on these same people and what they have to do. We also have this issue that simply farmers who are making up the backbone of the economy in a lot of these places really do lack access to capital. It's already tenuous enough to be a farmer, much less to take out a loan to do so. Even when the policy is good, a lot of times what the Jeff is working on is things like policy, say a land rights policy or land management policies, you may still have implementation that lags. So I think of Kenya, where we have supported a new Land Rights Act, or new sort of Community Lands Act. But then you actually have individuals have to go out, or communities have to go out and register their lands, and they have to go through a process. Folks who have very little education and very little knowledge of what's happening need to go through a process. It costs apparently about $10,000. You'll need a lawyer. You need some people who really know what they're doing to help them go through the process to register their land and gain that security on their land. So then that encourages them to act in a way that is sustainable and is thinking about it long term, which brings me to this issue of land rights and land tenure security. I think that's what Pedro was referring to earlier, and that is really one of I would call that like a core issue to get at. And if you don't have that, then the incentives that are out there for farmers are to work in a from a short-term perspective rather than a longer-term perspective. I would also highlight the lack of trusted actors. So again, for people who have less education, are in rural areas, and don't necessarily understand things, how do they know that the people that they're interacting with and are presenting them with an approach are really people they can and should trust? Again, going back to the Maasai, where I spent some time recently, they were talking about how a pretty significant government official had worked with some communities to register their lands, basically in his name. And so that kind of issue, that how do you make sure that you have reputable, trusted people who are moving these processes forward, are present, and that people know that they can trust them as well. And then I would also point out that it's not just kind of on the lending side that you have a lack of expertise. In the agriculture sector, we often see that people lack, so agricultural extension officers, or people who are supposed to be supporting farmers, often lack training in these more ecologically based systems. So Pedro mentioned agro-civil pastoral systems, which are some of my favorites. I'll break that down really quickly. These are systems that mix agriculture, pastures, cattle, other animals, and then timber sources. So it looks more like a forest, and it can have incredible impacts. I've seen tripling of yields from cattle, say, in those systems, while you get fruit and you get timber, and you have a lower impact on the soils. And so I love that he mentioned that, because I'm a big champion of them. But what you can have is that the agricultural extension officers, what they know is to use more chemicals, to use modified seeds, for instance. Not necessarily saying that those are always bad, but that lack of education and lack of understanding of how these systems work, which are more complicated systems to implement, right? It's much easier to just throw some corn, basically, or scatter corn on a field than it is to manage an integrated system. And so you need that support, but then you also, you lack it. And then so moving forward, and then building on that point, and I feel like coming from the funding side, I get to call this out a bit. Funders often want quick results. And the problem with biodiversity and, say, taking more ecologically based approaches to things like forestry, to fisheries, to agriculture, is that it takes time to yield results. So it's really easy to throw some fertilizer on a field and see higher yields. What takes a lot longer is to convert to a more ecologically based system, fewer inputs, lower impact. You might start to get carbon sequestration benefits, biodiversity benefits. Long run, it's hopefully more sustainable for the farmers, as they don't have to, put out a bunch of money at the beginning and then all dependent on their crop yield at the end. However, that is not a quick process. That does not yield results in 2 years. Farmers are inherently risk averse, and I think fairly, with all reason. And so, you know, you want to show people how it works, and then you need the technical support. You need the agricultural extension officer coming out and talking with people and working with them. And then they need those resources to help them actually implement. And so there's a lot of different pieces that have to come together. So if you wanted just a few challenges in what we're trying to do here, this is kind of my many issues that I see outlined, and I've, you know, kind of building on and echoing some of what has already been shared. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think I will wrap up the challenge later on, but let's move on because time is going on, and I think that we need at least to end up not on the too negative aspect of the issues, which is extremely complex, and try to look at what could be or what are already the existing solutions. And I will give back the floor to Alexander. Alexander?
Thank you, Philippe. Something which has been said already by Pedro, which is the need, the very important. Yes.
Yes, it's okay.
Can you hear me, Philippe?
Yeah.
Yes. So need to have a much better coordination to deal with this very high level of complexity, which is underpinning biodiversity. So coordination means having all people along the financial value chain involved, so to have the rural communities and also to have the people along the physical and the agricultural value chain that has to be coordinated and work together. Capacity building, of course, is key. Sarah was mentioning the fact that farmers often didn't have the level of training sufficient to manage those natural-based solutions. It's very true, and it's even truer when it comes to loan officers that are supposed to assess the risk that they are taking while disbursing a loan to those beneficiaries. It's important to offer short-term incentives to compensate for the additional effort which is required. So that's why it needs to be embedded into innovative financial instruments. So we discussed about sustainability-linked loans, and we know that the inclusive finance community is more and more using this kind of tools because they are actually enabling to align the interest of the lendees with the one of the lender, which is great. I think one of the solutions is also to help the IFSPs, so the microfinance institution, to identify opportunities. Not only the fact that they need to be more aware of the risk that they are taking and they are posing to their own clients, while not asking for this additional level of disclosure and transparency, but also to help them to identify opportunities in countries where the GDP is also made to a great extent by the primary and by the agricultural sector. We've seen that many microfinance institutions are actually exiting or withdrawing from the financing of rural communities because of its riskier and riskier nature. And what we want is really to help them to master the tools to better manage their risk, but also to seize the opportunities that comes with the financing of the ecological transitions. And I think it can be one of the solutions. Finally, I would just say that you need to have an inclusive and a specialist, but also a pragmatic approach as a lender. Specialist is not always used when it comes to finance because we are not specialists. We are let's say generalist, as we say in France. So you need to get helped by experts, and that's why it's important to form coalitions. That's why it's important to work with the experts such as Sarah from the Jeff to help you to better understand the issue at stake. And being inclusive means understand where the institution you want to finance is starting from. and start by building, baseline, and not exclude the ones that are not already convinced internally that it's actually something that they should do in order to better protect, their customer, but also to better protect their, their own institution. So it's important not to exclude, anyone, to accept also a gradual and fragmental data collection in order to assess the progresses that are made. If you want to be pragmatic, you can't have, a holistic and very expert vision. And my last advice as basis for a solution would be to be ready to split the bill. So all of those services are coming at a cost, and you need to be ready to take some of the cost on you. And as Pedro said, nature and biodiversity is not is still too cheap. And it's our role to put like a proper price for the ecosystem services that that nature is bringing, not only to smallholder farmers, but also at the end of the day to us. Thanks, Philippe.
Okay, thank you. I like the view to say that, especially as funder, that not to look at it as on a risk basis, but rather as an opportunity. I think it's clearly a way to look at it a little bit differently. Pedro, your view of potential solutions? Your microphone. Your micro is not on.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, first of all, I think Alexander's example of the explosive cocktail is brilliant, right? It's a way of expressing what I call the gradual extinction of diversity and microfinance. I mean, when troglodytes like Mohammed Yunus and I began this, there was a much better balance in microfinance. It was really in agricultural finance. There was a balance. It was probably about half and half urban and half agricultural. If you look today, you have to look far and beyond to find a big microfinance that has more than 3 or 4% in agriculture. So the explosive cocktail we have, so there's a first stage, not only moving to opportunities, Alexander, but it's first of all, going back in time and having our third tier financiers put up a criteria saying, if you finance agriculture, you have a chance of getting close to where biodiversity still exists. And that's a third tier decision that has to be made. Otherwise, we're going to continue with the extinction of diversity in microfinance. And as I've said, I think microfinance is a route to face biodiversity extinction. So that's very, very important. And then if we go through and we just see, let me do the second and third tier financiers. And you were talking about risk, Alexander, right? So if we look at lower risk for microfinance, for microenterprise, everyone's going to give you lower risk loans. That's all they're concerned about, really. If you're looking for lower risk inclusive loans, there's very few. What do we mean by inclusive in NITLAPAN FDL? By inclusive, we mean financing people who are not viable for credit. Our reasons for financing someone is that they don't work as a microfinance, as a microenterprise. They are not viable for a loan. Those are the people we have to get to. And you know what we found? We found that financing people who are not viable for loans, actually they respond better to the ecosystem, to biodiversity than people who are responsible. That is, we have more gains from them. They do more for nature. Why? Because they depend more on nature. But they're also, Sarah, not only more dependent on nature, but more able to transform nature the way it should be for their life. And this is very crucial, and we've also found that in normal times, if we're not in a political crisis, if we're not in a major recession or depression, that these people who were not really micro entrepreneurs, they pay better than those who were micro entrepreneurs. That is, that our portfolio at risk with these people who are not worthy of loans is actually better. But now when you go into a crisis, of course, if there's any kind of a microeconomic crisis in the country, all these people just fall off the wall. And so the level of risk they have, the quality of their portfolio goes down, and it even gets worse than the others. But when we're in normal conditions, these are the people who can do it. If we look at the third type of loan, lower risk, inclusive, and environmental, there's very, very few financiers who are interested in that, right? And then if we look at the fourth one, which is non-financial services, right, for microenterprise, it's really only non-profit cooperation and some bilaterals, right? Norfund has been doing this with us, and they're really alone in this, of finance, non-financial services, territorial and training. And then when we get down to the final thing, if what's a funding priority? Resilient ecosystems. Really, the only people we find on the scene are clientelistic public subsidy programs. That is, programs that are so clientelistic that they even though they say they want to do something for the ecosystem, we're going backwards with them because they are not allowing any locally led transformation to happen on the ground. So when you look at this thing, I mean, this is a whole message, and it's really the third tier that have to start this. The third tier have to say, we really want to make the transition to ecosystem. We want to move away from enterprise, and if BNP doesn't do it, well, no one down below that level is going to be able to do it. And so when we talk about the first microfinance revolution, what was it? It was that we lowered the cost of transaction of a loan so that we could put millions of people in the industry. Now, the new revolution is just saying we have to increase the cost of transaction of a loan by putting a very high price on nature and by putting a high price on the actors who are not good entrepreneurs, among the excluded. We can make those excluded more worthwhile. We can make nature more worthwhile. We have a chance at locally led adaptation, and we have a chance to begin to let the ecosystems define the microfinance products. Here's the bottom line. We all, at microfinance, we like to define the financial product. We've got to stop designing it. We've got to let local, multiple actors in an ecosystem, even public actors, design a loan. And that's the major revolution, right? That it is we give up the control of defining who designs the financial product, who supervises it, who gets money from it. We have to change that. It's a huge transformation. I think we can actually make it, right? I think, I'm very impressed today to see that Sarah and Alexander are actually on the same page. That's very rare, Saad, as you know, that you talk to a bank that's on the same page you are. But anyway, I'm very happy with this. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We need to have to move on, but good to have this final positive view on how, and I think it definitely goes to what has been said in terms of collaboration between the different type of actors, not working in silos anymore. I think it's definitely one of the trend, and I think that the Just Institute is really for that. So Davide, few minutes on this.
Yes, so thanks a lot. And indeed, I would like to summarize through Just Institute as really proposing as a platform and a place where various stakeholders that want to move forward into scaling up financial and non-financial support for financial intermediary for climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation should look at. So how do we try to make that happen? So the Just Institute try to do what other does not do, and so generate the condition for the other to act. So we provide product and services to try to break some of the barrier we have been identified. So we've been identified the barrier of lack of transparency. So we work with financial intermediary institutions to better understand what do they finance, which process do they have in place. So to understand what is inside the portfolio can be classified as biodiversity, conservation as climate change adaptation and inclusive for women smallholder. And then we support this certification. That will be a process to understand, to provide better transparency into the market so that the institutions that are, let's say, finance ready can receive this finance to scale up their impact and eventually with better condition. And the ones that are not yet can receive additional and tailored support to generate the capacity they are missing to then being able to receive this finance. That is one intervention. The second one, we provide ongoing training and capacity buildings to the financial intermediary first. So really to try to generate capacity there to make finance for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation flow to the one that need the most. So we support loan officer and management of financial institution, being a local bank, being a microfinance institution or cooperatives, or any other kind of financial channel locally, to understand how to identify climate risk and biodiversity risk for the clients and their portfolio, and to how to look for solutions to compensate for this risk and to grab the opportunity to finance in a sustainable way their target market and increase their revenue. And last but not least, we provide operational strategical advisory at this stage at public and private investors to shape their products so that, as Alex was explaining, so we can put a right price on our financing. So if a finance will generate resiliency, that should have a lower interest rate because the loan will be less risky. And if it's generating biodiversity impact and or resiliency, of course, need to have a lower interest rate because you're contributing to restore biodiversity we depend in and decreasing risk. So we help financial institutions to shape and to disburse this product. Of course, we build, and that I think is key, to break the logic on project by projects on existing framework and successful methodology. Some of the one I presented before to keep them updated and to mainstream within the sector. There's a couple of examples of things we're gonna do in the next month together with the GEF, financed by the GEF, together with IFAD as an implementing agency and with the BNP Paribas and the Fondation Agronomique Agricole. We're gonna implement a couple of, I would believe, catalytic projects where we want to pilot and then scale up these services into the market in 5 countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. One project is focused in certification of climate change adaptation of portfolio, and well as nature-based solutions, so biodiversity part. So really to try to identify how much into financial intermediary can support biodiversity conservation and then link potentially with better favorable conditions for loans. And the other one projects instead is focused into indicators at the level of financial intermediary that can allow us to identify the institutions that are better practiced to manage biodiversity risk and climate risk, and then tailor loans with better favorable condition if an institution can show progresses, improve the resiliencies of my clients and improve the biodiversity conservation of my clients. I want to close that this clearly is not the private offer by the Just Institute, but it aims to be catalytic for the market. So the Just Institute is member base. So our idea is to include as many members as possible to accompany us into this transition and to allow us to provide the right solution. So we are humble, we are listening to you, and we're gonna shape the product to the needs of the market. So if someone of you is interested, just ring a bell and we are able to welcome you into our institute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Davide, for opening the door. I think that is key. I think that we understand that we cannot work alone on this subject. And Sarah, you were the first to start. You're going to be the last one to speak. We are completely out of time, but that's okay. Just have 2-3 minutes, and then we're gonna, I guess, to close if maybe 1-2 questions. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I will try to move very quickly, and I appreciate people's time. This has been really interesting. I just, in the solution side, I see that from our side, when it comes to what we can do, it's getting the policy and enabling environment right, making the rules such that, for a farmer, it's, he doesn't have to clear his land to get, or his or her land to get, for the government to recognize ownership, all kinds of things like that. We have to work at multiple scales and levels. So you need to be working on supply chains, cooperatives, as well as individuals. That oftentimes what is needed and what will actually work is loans. It doesn't have to be grant money. I come from a kind of a grant focused world. So we can, scale our impact through loans, and have greater results with more money if we're not just stuck in kind of a grant perspective. But at the same time, with that, you need technical support and you need long-term partnership, right? I'm trying to remember, I think Alexandra said this, you also combining resources. So let's look across grants, loans, investments. Let's talk about the value of the work that you're doing for carbon, for biodiversity, for water, and then for kind of the more traditional activities when it comes to agriculture, right? So if you start to combine those pieces, you can find a combination that will work and will, the formula that works for a particular context to cover what you might need to cover, and how you approach this. One of the pieces that when it comes to thinking about things like carbon and biodiversity, we have to remember, we'll often talk about what the value of those services are. But when it comes to working with people on the ground, and I pull this lesson from Costa Rica's Payments for Ecosystem Services program, they didn't cover the full value. They don't pay people the full value of what they're doing. They pay them the opportunity cost. So that's what you need to cover. You just need to make it more worthwhile to do one activity over another. You don't have to say, well, here's the full value, but we don't have the money to cover that piece of things. I would also highlight, focusing on women, and as Pedro said, indigenous peoples, local peoples, people on the ground who are often already doing these activities, but just need a little bit of help. They're the ones who are, they're the ones on the front lines, and they're the ones who are going to deliver these benefits. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the need for a well thought through theory of change. And that is a term that gets thrown around a lot in development. It's what's your theory of change? But I was really struck by USAID has done some work on, they call it conservation enterprise. And they have really looked at what is kind of the missing piece in all of these different circumstances. So, my old school memory of what microfinance is, oh, they're going to make some handicrafts. We're going to give them some money to make some handicrafts so they can sell it to tourists. But and there's been plenty of projects like that, or we're going to have them do beekeeping. But you have to think through, is there a market for it? What's the supply chain? How are all of these pieces? It's not, I think it can be easy sometimes to just focus on the individuals and see, okay, maybe this is what they can do. But there's a need to have kind of this larger and more overarching understanding of the problem and, what the potential solutions are and what is really the gaps that are the barriers to make sure that we're trying to target the right activities. Hopefully that's short. We can take any questions.
Thank you. I think we are really over time. I don't know if, because it's 8 o'clock and 7 minutes, we were expecting to close 7 minutes ago. Is there any questions, remark at that level? You can either talk on the chat board or is a question, can you define territorial services? Is this land tenure and rights? I think it's addressed. Oh no, that's you that were asking the question, Sarah, no?
Yes, it was of Pedro. And I'll take advantage of having the floor to just one last thought that had come to me and I meant to include, which is that when we talk about risk, we often talk about the risk of action. And I would hope that we are starting to talk about the risk of inaction, the risk of business as usual. And so with that, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're not going to always know, what are the best approaches. But if you use safeguards and make sure that you're kind of doing no harm, we have to act. We need to be getting out there and trying to do things differently. So then I'll let Pedro talk.
Thanks a lot. I think we're going to close now. I think personally, I've learned a lot. I think that we have different pictures, different point of view. I think that we are all aware that there is urgency, that we don't have that much time, and we cannot do it alone. So I think that it was repeated a lot. The need to work together, the need to share together information and to share together strategy and so on. And I hope that this webinar will have help also to do this together. I saw also the issues of complexity, new type of financing that we need to be innovative. Mohamed Yunus said that microfinance were there to help people to be innovative, to help people to be creative in what they wanted to do. So I think that more than ever, we need to bring innovation in the sectors, as you mentioned. I don't know if it's going to be a second revolution, but for sure, there's things to be, lots of things to be done that needs to be done together. And I really wanted to thank you all for the time we spent together this evening. Thanks a lot, and I'm sure we're going to have opportunity to work together in the future. Thanks, and I'm going to close the webinar now. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Philippe.
Bye to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And if you all are going to be in Montreal, let me know. Where
Okay.
Jeff comes out in force. That's our place, and we'd love to. We are always we do a bunch of side events. We have our own pavilion actually in Montreal, and so we'll need to be filling that out and having hopefully some interesting events. And
That's a fantastic opportunity, Sarah. We'll be in touch for that.
Yeah, so let me know.
By the way, there are a few people still there, and that it will be registered. There will be a second section on biodiversity, inclusive finance, the European Microfinance Week. Keep posted and participate to that as well. So we will have a financial instrument for biodiversity, inclusive finance.
Okay,
Yeah.
so first meet in Luxembourg and then meet us in Montreal.
Voilà.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.